Okay, the city of Detroit has seen tremendous growth and revitalization over the last 10 years, things that as a native Detroiter, I never imagined might happen here. But that success is not felt equally throughout our city. Though the vision is there, the question is, what is it really going to take for success to be seen and experienced throughout all of our neighborhoods? In 2016, one of the themes of the Mackinac Policy Conference was investing in our future. And that year, Mayor Mike Duggan's keynote focused on what we need to do to equitably rebuild Detroit into a vibrant and inclusive city. And a lively discussion moderated by Soledad O'Brien took a look back at lessons that were learned from the summer of '69 in Detroit, or '67 in Detroit. Let's take a look.
The interesting thing is we're at a transition point in the administration. The first 2 years, every single Wednesday morning at Cabinet, we went down those numbers religiously. We had to get in the discipline of delivering results on time. This last year, we've been transitioning to exactly what Sandy was talking about. We're to the point now of saying, what do we want this city to be? And our question is really very simple. This is the question we start every week with. How do we rebuild Detroit into a vibrant city with a recovery that provides opportunity to everyone? That's the focal point of what we're trying to accomplish. And so what does that mean? And as we thought about it, we thought a city, our vision has 7 things. First, we got to transform the physical landscape from blight removal. That's a big part of it. Until we get rid of the blight, you can't have any vision for the city. Then we've got to develop advantages that are uniquely Detroit. We can't just copy somebody else. We got to do something that's authentic. We got to attract businesses and jobs at all skill levels so that it can be available to everybody. We need to build a culture of entrepreneurialism. You like these things, all right? We got to have housing options for everybody in the city, okay? We've got to have opportunities for our young people, and we have to build a first-class school system, all right? If we do those 7 things, this city looks dramatically different in 5 years.
Welcome, everybody. It's such an interesting idea, I think, looking backwards before you can really move forward. So I want to begin, if I may, kind of in the middle, which is what lessons were learned from the summer of 1967. And when I say learned, I don't mean noted or written about. I meant like what were actually learned and moved forward in some kind of specific and tangible, life-changing way.
The lack of opportunities for people of color to get real jobs that made living a full and rich life possible. That's something we still are facing here today.
There are some great things going on in Detroit, no question about it. And you can see those things. But the real test of the viableness of our city and the vitality of it is the inclusiveness of all of its citizens. You can't build a moat around downtown Detroit. You can't build a moat around Midtown. You gotta build a bridge. I think the mayor's attempting to do that. But the question is, do we have the will? After we do sermons on Sunday morning, we have the benediction. The question is, what you gonna do after the benediction? This is the sermon here. What's gonna happen once we do the benediction, when you say, thank y'all for coming, and we go back to Detroit and our various communities? How do we implement those things that we're suggesting?
On one hand, we saw Detroit lag the rest of the country for many years in local business starts, in local entrepreneurs learning how to succeed and being able to succeed and having opportunities. We see some of that turning around now. Revan's absolutely right. It's not being equally shared, and that's why I use this phrase, equitable development. You can't assume one tide will lift all boats.
Absolutely.
You've got to be very intentional about it. Mm-hmm. But it's more than business. It's in fact more than livelihoods. It's also places to come together. Yep. Places for dialogue. Yep. It's places to move ahead as one city.
I do think there's a material and significant difference in the last, since Mayor Duggan was elected, in the legitimate commitment of the business community to reach not just downtown. The narrative for years, it's the Detroit story.
What's changed?
The neighborhood versus downtown. The session that I was just in before this one, where there was the discussion with about creating a learning a structure that gets kids in this Detroit high schools from in a position to actually learn career training and have an opportunity to both go to community college or to go to a four-year college. Things are this didn't. I've been around here 68 years. Trust me, that was not what was happening after 67 between 67 and 72 and onward. Those things have materially changed.
We want to work with businesses, and we support those businesses who are supporting us. But it's one thing to be philanthropic relative to doing some food, doing some scholarships. It's another thing to be participatory relative to your procurement practices, to your senior management levels, to where you do your investments, to where you have some sort of pacts in the community where you do development, where you do training, where you do participation in business development. A lot of businesses say, well, why don't you all send us a program or a proposal for what should happen in your community? Well, small businesses and community folk don't have those kind of resources. You have resources, you have people that look at the country and say what's working in certain areas. Share that with local communities, small business people, so they can do what they're saying.
And joining me now to talk about the need for equality and taking care of our communities and neighborhoods is Skillman Foundation President and CEO, Tonya Allen. Tonya, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Stephen.
You as well. And CEO of CitizenDetroit and former Detroit City Councilwoman, Sheila Cockrel. Sheila, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Good to be with both of you.
So, Tonya, I'm going to start with you. That speech we heard from the mayor was in 2016. That's 4 years ago. He stood for re-election since then. Lots of other things have happened since then. But that speech was really a call to action, I felt like, a call to refocus some of the things that we have been doing for a while on the question of equity. So tell me, in 2020, how far have we gotten with that charge?
Well, I think that we have generations of inequities that have happened in our country. So it's not going to get done overnight or even in a short period of time. And it isn't going to just get done by government. If we really want to deal with inequities, we all have to roll up our sleeves and be a part of this. And I think part of what we need to help people understand is that inequity or equity is not just about inclusion. It's about actually eliminating, the things that create these systematic barriers. And so we have to deal with that, and we got to make sure that everybody understands that and are working on it. So we got to move from this notion of what I would describe as charity and move to justice. So how do we embed justice in every system in our city, in every sector, in business, and in the nonprofit sector, in our neighborhoods, and also with government? I think those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, not just how do we include people. I think when we talk inclusion, we are missing the boat on that. And I think there are some places where we've done well on this, and then there are others where we still are struggling. And then the last thing I would just say is that, this is exacerbated, as you know, when we're in the middle of a pandemic. Because not just with the impacts of that pandemic, as the earlier panelists talked about, but even when we come to decision making. When we're in moments like this, when it comes to decision making, we get far more comfortable with fewer people making decisions. And guess what those people look like, right? So we have to make sure that we're dealing with these issues in good times and bad times, and that we're thinking about how we promote equity and justice.
Yeah. I feel like people are talking more about this subject than they used to, or at least acknowledging that it's one of the subjects that we've got to deal with here in the city. Sheila, when you talked with Soledad O'Brien and the other panelists, there was that acknowledgement that this is one of the driving issues in our community. But are we doing better? Are we doing it differently than we were before?
I think some steps have been taken, Stephen, but I think the essence of what Tonya just said, that it can't be just inclusion, it's got to be about justice. And that once you go to that platform in the reality of the American experience, you have to begin to address white privilege from the point of view of wealthy white people to white privilege for poor white people. I do think, and really the events of the past week have brought this in even more stark relief with what happened to Mr. Floyd, and the Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper issue in New York, that I think white people are now in general, and I think a lot of the people, white folks in Detroit, are beginning to understand there's an issue here around privilege that has just never been addressed. I think it's a beginning conversation. It's going to be a tough conversation for white people among each other, and then for white people and people of color to really come to grips with it, because what it really will fundamentally mean is that the pie is going to be redistributed on an equitable basis. That means things will change in many different levels for folks who are white.
Yeah. Tonya, I always get a little nervous when there's an emergency or some sort of tragedy, because I think people's instincts are to tighten up and recoil from things that they might have been willing to do or think about before. And I think as African Americans, we know what that means for us often is that there will be less opportunity. There may be less tolerance. I think that's one of the things that was really evident in this video of the police officer killing George Floyd in Minneapolis. I mean, there was an exasperation and an intolerance to that whole scene that I think is somewhat driven by the stress of the pandemic. What are the things we have to do to make sure we don't backslide to a worse time after all this is over, and can sort of keep our eye on, we have a lot of work to do to make progress?
Yeah, well, I would just say that it isn't just the intolerance in Minnesota, right? We see it even in our own backyard. We saw it in Washtenaw with Shatina Grady Hale, where she was abused by an officer. And so I guess what I would say is, I think we have to be diligent, but we also have to set some expectations for ourselves. And I think one of the ways that we're going to have to do that as a region is that we have to take on this issue, begin to have the same language. You know, we should be creating a structure where we talk about what it means to have equity in our community, how we're trying to dismantle racism, how we're trying to promote justice. Once we get clear about that and have the language, then we can stop having conversations where we're blaming and people are feeling guilty, but we actually can have conversations that are about aspirations, about what does it mean to actually make neighborhoods viable opportunity centers for children and for people who live there? What does it mean that when we talk about workforce development, that we actually want to talk about how families build prosperity and build wealth, not just how do they get a job that will take them out to be essential workers in the middle of the pandemic, even though I'm extraordinarily appreciative of them. And so I think part of what we have to do is we need to name a vision. How can we be the Blackest city in America and we've never really tackled race? There are all kinds of cities all across the country that have basically said, look, we're going to take on this issue. We're going to talk about it. We're going to look at these systemic barriers that are going on, and that we will have the language in the community to actually respond to it. And I think that's part of what's missing, is that we need our business leaders. They need racial equity training. We need Black folks. They need racial equity training. White folks need it. We all need it. And I think if we can get into that space of saying we need to invest this in ourselves so that we actually invested in our city and invested in our future, then that's going to position us well. But if we continue to ignore this or use cold language to talk about Black people or the disparities, like urban or the folks who live in the city or people of color. No, we're talking about some things that are far more deeper than that. And we need to start naming it and stop pretending and not be scared of it. Because the only thing that fear does, it prevents us from moving forward. And it's time for us to move forward as a region, as a city.
Yeah. Sheila, I worry that the pandemic, again, is moving people to move backwards to spaces that they used to be in. I think anyone who has this conversation about how white people in particular respond to this comes to that space of how do we get white people who get it to be able to communicate with white people who are still really resistant to the idea that we even need to talk about race or inequality. I wonder what you think about the opportunity or the challenge to get that done.
Stephen, I think the challenge has been there. It's not a new challenge. I mean, race has been in my opinion, the single biggest divider and division point in southeastern Michigan for the last 45, 50 years. And to Tonya's point, code language is used. We talk about diversity. We talk about opportunity, all of these words. And I really support the notion of coming up with a common language. I do believe there are many more white people of goodwill who just don't have the language and don't have the sort of framework to figure out how to have the conversation. I think it's a really important work that needs to be done. I think the pandemic, in a sense, makes it more critical. However, the pandemic also creates this enormous challenge. I mean, CitizenDetroit, we get people together to have dinner and dialogues. You can't do that. And who knows in the foreseeable future when you're going to be able to get a group of people of any city or suburban together to talk. So figuring out what the tools are to try to start this conversation because of the moment, because of the pandemic, because of the stark ways in which the pandemic has shown people for whom it used to be sort of, well, people who do the service jobs is sort of it. People don't really identify who that is and what it means. And today people know that the folks who are in the Maine and many parts of the region taking the biggest risks to keep the systems moving are African-American people. Folks, you can't look away from that. And it's a different experience for white people to experience race in this way. So what the direction is, I don't think it's been, it's sort of, nobody's gone to a mountain and come down with a tablet yet that I know of. But I do think it's an important discussion. It's one that I would personally really want to be, a participant in, because the future of the region, the state, and for that matter, the United States of America rests on dealing with how race and inequality and lack of equity has deformed what was a fascinating idea back in the day when people came up with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah. Tonya, before the pandemic, I felt like we were seeing philanthropy, and when I say that, I mean philanthropy as a community, pivot a bit into this space, or more into this space than they had been. But of course, philanthropy is affected by this, like everybody else. I mean, money is tighter everywhere. I wonder if you can help us understand what the conversations have been like among philanthropic interests about how to maintain that focus, or the need to maintain that focus, even though things don't look the same financially, and maybe that there's even more of a need because you're going to see others who are in that space have to pull back to do other things.
Yeah, well, I think that in these moments of crisis, we need to actually invest in the things that are core to our values. And that means not walking away from this issue of racial equity. And I think that there are so many foundations who've been committed to this work beforehand that will continue to be committed to it. And many of them are spending more, they're relaxing their rules so that our nonprofit leaders and partners have the resources that they need and have the flexibility to act and behave in the way that they know their communities require of them. And so I think you see a lot of movement and shift in philanthropy there. But I also think that this is that moment for philanthropy too, to go just a level deeper. What is our commitment on this issue of racial equity as a community? How are we thinking about it and talking about it? How are we making our strategies specifically that will support particular people in particular races. We know that general strategies just don't work. And don't, we always say a rising tide always lifts all boats. We know that not to be true. We know that there are certain strategies, if you use them more broadly, that they just don't reach certain populations. And when we know that when we're in crisis, that African Americans in general, it takes them longer to even recover. They're dying more from the pandemic. It takes them longer to recover from an economic downturn. And they're, being assaulted in all of these other kinds of ways. And, people are just exhausted. And I think it would be great to see philanthropy and the nonprofit sector really just lift up in this moment. This is our clear aspiration. This is how we're going to invest in this. These are the goals that we're going to be expecting. And if there are others who are not committed to those same things, then we need to decide maybe on choosing different partners or choosing people who are willing to learn and to go that extra mile. This is the time where we should be doubling down. We do not need to retreat because we're in a bad economy. I've heard many times people say, well, when the economy gets better. Well, it doesn't happen then either. So I want to make sure that we don't retreat when it's a bad economy. We can't retreat ever. I think that's the big picture.
Yeah. Sheila, before the pandemic, CitizenDetroit was doing some of the work that I think is really critical to this idea of equity, and that's education. Education in the big sense, right? Making sure that people have the information that they need to live their lives to the fullest in a civic sense and in a private sense. And the disruption of the pandemic, I think, as you pointed out, makes the specific things that you were doing much more difficult. And to imagine when we might get to do them again. Talk about what pivot then needs to be made to make sure that work continues.
Stephen, I think a couple of things. One, we've continued to we've been doing many more things online. In fact, this evening, we're starting our Civics 101 project to talk about the role of the governor and emergency powers. And Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist is going to be our special guest to sort of give people the facts. Here are the facts. Here's where power comes from. Here's what the responsibilities are. Here's the check and balance. We want to build that out. I personally want to also do a series on the history of the city, because I really think we don't really understand. How do we get to where we are? How do we have this pattern of residential racial segregation in southeastern Michigan? There's history to this that I think would be really interesting kinds of pod or whatever these things are, Zoom events. The other thing I really want to work with on is taking things into neighborhoods, using old school sound cars, using sandwich boards tied to texting technology to sort of create a little mini town square with socially distant dynamics or rules to keep conversations going. So you'd really want to explore how to do that. That becomes it's labor intensive. The cost for doing that is a lot bigger than if you want to do it at scale than a couple of dinner and dialogue. So we are exploring ways. I think that grassroots engagement, old school grassroots engagement, is going to be the partner to the use of Zoom and other platforms for online engagement. And I think there's a way to keep it going. This city has a tradition for engagement, this region does, that is not going to be stopped by a pandemic. You see all the parades that are happening. Let's have a civic engagement parade. Let's have some census parades. Let's take the message to each other and keep people talking.
Okay, Tonya, Alan, and Sheila Cockrel, really great to talk with you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Okay, and that'll do it for our discussion today. You can join my colleague, Christy McDonald, tomorrow at 12 for the final day of MPC Moments. Thank you to the Detroit Regional Chamber, to Detroit Public Television, and of course to all of our sponsors. Everyone have a great day and continue to stay safe.